Welcome, everyone. So today we are fortunate to have Nick Schmidt from Solus.ai and BLDS, and he's going to be talking about fairness in machine learning. So before we get started, I want to welcome you all to the Quant University weekly machine learning guest lecture series. We've been hosting these sessions close to 2 years now. So we've had more than 50 amazing speakers from the academic community, from the practitioner community, people who have been researching various themes in machine learning and artificial intelligence, but also thinking about how do we pragmatically adopt it in the industry. So as you know, the challenges of machine learning adoption has been growing significantly over the last few years. It's a blessing in disguise in some ways, because we are now having the computational power, the tools, the methodologies, and the level of maturity wherein we are seeing pragmatic use cases. When I was studying machine learning 20 years ago, most of the discussions were restricted to, discussion papers and concepts and possibilities, which was, the final outcome was a theoretical paper you would publish in a journal or a conference. But today you're seeing so many use cases. And as many of you know, I teach a couple of courses in these topics at Northeastern University too, along with the courses we offer at Quant University. And it's always fascinating to see, the maturity of the themes. And I was kind of looking at some of the materials I was teaching just 4 or 5 years ago. And we were just kind of scraping through the surface of, okay, so here's a Jupyter notebook, and here's the Titanic data set, and here's MNIST, and you're good to go. You're ready for the industry. And in today's day and age, you have to factor in so many different themes, especially when you're trying to make sure that the tools we are deploying are robust and secure and explainable and fair. There are so many different aspects which has to be thought about. And comprehensively, we have to look at it from the purview of risk management. And artificial risk management is becoming an important theme. As you can see, there's been a lot of discussion in the regulatory space about how do we make sure that we adopt responsibly all these AI-related concepts, but also we're seeing a lot of discussions in communities thinking about building out frameworks on how do we self-police and make sure that we are adopting many of these tools responsibly. And Nick and I, we are a part of a cohort group which is building out a framework and building out various aspects of a responsible AI framework, which we will release in the next few months. But today, I thought we'll welcome Nick Schmidt to talk about the topic of fairness. And as many of you know, fairness is a very important theme in the context of building out machine learning algorithms. And it's also part of the certificate program we offer here at Quant University. So I'm just going to, for people who are new, I'm just going to briefly tell a little bit about it. So the themes of not only building machine learning algorithms, but also in the context of model risk management, which is a significantly mature field in the financial services world. How do we bring in aspects of coherent adoption of principles of model risk management for AI and machine learning models is a very important theme. But also, when we think about building out different models, how do we test it? How do we audit it? How do we make sure that we can build out the governance structures and the right tooling in place so that you can make sure that you are not only thinking about the models, but holistically looking at the whole aspects of it. So in this realm, we have partnered with the premier organizations, the Professional Risk Managers Organization, and offering a certificate program. So the launch has already happened, but next week we have our first live session, which is on March the 21st, and it's a full day session. So for people who are interested in learning more about the certificate program, I would recommend check out quantuniversity.com to know about the program. And if possible, I would hope you would join us in this journey. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Nick. Nick Schmidt is the CEO of Solus AI and is the AI practice leader at BLDS LLC. He has more than 20 years of experience working at the intersection of statistics, law, and regulatory policy. In recent years, his primary focus has been the statistical analysis of discrimination and algorithmic decisioning, especially in the areas of consumer credit, housing, insurance, and employment. At BLDS, Nick has provided expert guidance to companies and regulators addressing questions of algorithmic fairness, explainable AI, and ensuring robust model governance practices. Out of his work at BLDS, he has led the development of Solus AI, a software platform that tests for and mitigates algorithmic discrimination. And Nick is a dear friend. He and I, we spend at least a few hours thinking about these themes every week, and we have weekly discussions. So I'm very fortunate to have you on our discussion here, Nick. Welcome to the program. And I will hand over the stage to you. Nick, you're on mute, I guess. Can everybody hear Nick?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Perfect.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Technology. I'm new to Zoom. Well, apologies for that. And Sri, thank you very much for asking me. It's really an honor. And one of the things I love most about the machine learning community and getting involved in it in the last 5 or 6 years is just how amazing so many people are in it. And you, I consider a good friend, and I've been honored to work with you and honored to be here today. So thank you. And so now I will share my screen and go through my presentation. So a pragmatic approach to fairness in machine learning. This is what I'm going to go through. Why am I talking about a pragmatic approach? Why you should be concerned about this? Conceptual view of the sources of disparity. And then I'm going to get into actual practice of measuring and mitigating discrimination. So why am I talking about a pragmatic approach? It's because that is what we have to do. The literature on fairness, the truth of fairness is such a broad philosophical concept. We're really not going to be able to address everything that we could address. There are always going to be trade-offs, which of course means some people are going to be harmed in the process relative to what they could be in a different regime. And so we really need to look at this from a pragmatic point of view and say, what can we do? What is the optimal thing for us as practitioners to do? And also to look at and try to shape policy and make sure that as regulations are coming out, they are effective and they're not overly burdensome and they're not stifling positive innovation. And so this is what I'm going to talk about today, and this is sort of the approach that I think of, as opposed to burn down the house would be the opposite of that. So getting right into it, with Sri's very nice introduction, I can skip over the little bit about me slide. Thank you, Sri. So this is one of my favorite examples of can algorithms discriminate, and I'll explain why. I mean, it's a horrible thing, but I'll explain why I think it is a good illustration. There was a study of facial recognition systems a number of years ago, and this really kind of this study kicked off a lot of the work in fair AI. But what it found was that 3 of the major facial recognition algorithms showed a really large amount of bias in terms of its ability to measure and predict gender. And the error rate for white men in assessing gender was about 1%. For white women, 7%. 7 times the error rate's pretty darn bad, I would think. But then when you get into people of color, for male people of color, it was 12%. and really a quite shocking 35% error rate for women of color. The reason why I like this is, as an example, is that I am sure, I don't know, but I'm willing to bet that no one who is designing this algorithm, who is training this model, intended it to be discriminatory. No one who trained the model thought that this would be the ultimate outcome, but this is what happened. The other thing about this is really the data on its own is not discriminatory. These are pictures of people. They were labeled as male or female, and that was put into the training data. Presumably that labeling was done correctly. If so, we still end up with a biased model. What was the reason for it? It was an underrepresentation of people of color in the data. That doesn't mean the data was wrong, it means it was underrepresented. And that is something that might not be the easiest thing to find. And certainly if you're not keyed into this issue, you probably won't know to do anything about it. And so this frames the problem. And what's especially difficult about it is that this is kind of the easiest case. And we get an error rate that's 35 times what it is for one group versus another. When we get into situations where there really is historical discrimination in the data, where there's much more error in the labeling process, where the model can be used in different contexts than in which it was originally developed, all of these problems potentially can compound upon them and make an error that much worse. So why do you care? And this is the business reason. Regulators and courts are looking to establish precedent. Everybody, just about everybody, understands that fairness is an issue in machine learning models. And there's more and more of an expectation that you are going to be expected to test for disparities and look for opportunities to reduce them. And as we move into this paradigm, it's important to understand this pragmatic approach and how we may be able to satisfy regulators, courts, and maybe even the front page of the New York Times. Here's some recent regulatory developments. New York City is requiring audits of every employment algorithm with pretty detailed requirements on disclosure. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is very active. And I'll say, in working with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, my experience is they have gotten significantly more sophisticated. They understand this stuff in a way that other regulators do not. And I think that presents some really good opportunities in that when we go to them, when you go to them with a model and it's valid, it's well built, it's well tested, I believe they're going to be able to understand that. But if you don't do that, then they're going to know. And so that's an example of where the education within the regulatory system is really coming up, and it's going to have an effect on expectations and outcomes for you as a model builder. There are more laws that are coming out and more regulations that are coming out than I can keep track of, but that's just to name a few. The other thing I want to point out, now this is the point that kind of gets to my heart, and it's the reason why I feel strongly about this. I love what I do, but it also keeps me up at night asking the question, am I doing a good enough job? And here what we have, the average homeowner in the United States has 80 times the net worth of the average renter. That means if you have created an algorithm for determining whether or not someone is going to be a homeowner, whether or not they're going to get a mortgage, and you get it wrong, you're potentially depriving the model through which you have built is potentially depriving people of net worth that passes down through generations. On the other hand, on the other side of the confusion matrix, there's been a study that found people who are in large amounts of debt, unsustainable amounts of debt, are 3 times more likely to have mental health problems than those who are not in debt. So if you're giving loans to people who really can't handle them and don't know that they can't handle them when they take them out, that's having a very deleterious effect on people. But can AI make this better? The question you want to start with, is it well designed and well implemented? Is it fair? So in other words, have you tested it? And that's what we want to get into. So a few reasons why AI might discriminate with a few examples. One is problematic data. There can just be an underrepresentation of certain groups of people, and then facial recognition was one example. Inaccurate or missing data. And in the credit invisibles, people who do not have credit scores are a very good example of that, because there is a huge advantage to being part of the standard credit banking system in the US and presumably other people, other places. But if you are not a part of that, because you don't have that initial data, it's really hard to move into it. And that, even though it's not going to be represented in the algorithm, it's represented in what is not in the algorithm. There can be differential patterns of causation and correlation. And then there can be models that incorporate past, present, or even potentially future discrimination. And predicted policing is a good example of that. There's also poorly built models. And unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot less of that these days, although there's still a fair amount of it. And there's the modeler who wants to throw every piece of data into the model without really thinking about the underlying causality, the underlying data generating process. And the question is, what could go wrong? Lots of things. And not only discrimination, but just having a bad model that doesn't get you what you want. And then there's the, we won't get venture capital funding if we use logistic regressions. Bring in the deep neural nets. Use the right tool for the purpose that you're building it for. Again, it's not just a discrimination question, but it absolutely can be, but it's just a proper model building question. And then there can be, believe that I copied the differential causation and correlation into both places. Well, it fits both places. And then the final one, and this is really important for you, because as regulations become more involved and regulators are starting to actually go ask questions about these, they're going to say, have you done testing? Have you tried to find a fairer model? And if you don't have evidence that you have made that attempt, then you are potentially engaged in discriminatory behavior. So next question is, what is fairness? Because this is really a difficult topic. It's philosophical, it's ethical, and we're data scientists, so maybe we're not necessarily the best equipped for it, but I'm going to give it a try. So there's sort of 4 quadrants of fairness. There's what you see is what you get. There is we are all equal. And then the other quadrants, which also are overlapping, are group fairness, which is to say, are all members of a group kind of overall treated fairly? And then there's individual fairness. And individual fairness is, am I being treated fairly, regardless of what other members of a particular group are being treated or how they're being treated. And this notion of what you see is what you get, the idea is that different skills, preferences, and different ability all go into a model, essentially. If we're thinking about an employment model, the education level you have, the experience you have, how smart you are, those things like that. To whatever degree that those can be measured, those manifest themselves in both the outcome observed, so do you do well at your job, as well as hopefully what the model is measuring and whether or not it's effective in measuring that. And what you see is what you get is the idea that this is measured at the individual level. So I have different skills than Sri, and it doesn't make sense in this paradigm for you to combine us and see what our outcomes are for employment. What makes sense is for you to look at them person by person. Is Sri getting paid the right amount? Am I getting paid the right amount, given those skills? I'm going to skip ahead and then go back, because this is as opposed to we are all equal as a paradigm. And what this essentially says is that if there are differences in observed outcomes, then that is in some way a manifestation of underlying discrimination. And that may not be present discrimination, it may not be discrimination of the model or of any intention, but the fact that in virtually every data set I've seen that African Americans have higher default rates, that's not because of some innate difference. It's the result of past, present, and potentially future discrimination that those things have happened, and there are those differential rates. These two paradigms are oftentimes at odds with each other, and we have to weigh them, and we do have to do some trade-offs potentially in terms of how we deal with them. Going back to this what you see is what you get approach, here we get into this group fairness versus individual fairness. And again, the group fairness is the lack of conditional parity across the entire group. So are you over predicting defaults for Blacks relative to whites in your model? And so if you over predict one person, you under predict another, that may balance out. And in a group fairness context, that would then not necessarily matter. And these can be measured as differential validity in legal circles, we refer to that, or differential prediction or bias. At the individual level, this is really focused on, am I experiencing a negative outcome? Am I being over predicted for default? Are you incorporating information about my race in an illegal manner? And that ultimately leads to different predictions. So if you include, are you African American or Black in a model, and you have, let's say it's a simple regression, a positive outcome is favorable, if that African American coefficient is negative, then you are discriminating at both an individual and a group level against African Americans, because it's only that factor that is driving the differences in the outcome. And this is referred to as disparate treatment. And disparate treatment in a US legal context is pretty much always wrong within housing, employment, and credit. And discrimination in the we are all equal, the group fair, and this is really a group fairness metric or measurement. And this is just asking, are the particular groups getting less favorable outcomes at a higher rate than another group? And it's not conditional on true outcomes. So are African Americans getting fewer loans than whites? If the answer is yes, then that constitutes evidence of what is called disparate impact. And that is a different legal framework for measuring discrimination. And there's a question about the legal versus the data scientist approach. And what I find is that data scientists hate disparate impact because it necessarily, or almost always necessarily, implies that you don't look at the label. So what a very typical conversation I'll have is I'll say, you want to just look at whether African Americans are receiving loans at lower rates than whites. And we almost always find that they are. If they are, then that is disparate impact. The response I get back from data scientists is, well, we're always going to see this because virtually always African Americans have worse credit outcomes. True. That doesn't mean that it's not there. And this is a policy question, it's a societal question, and essentially the law is saying, we don't care about the outcomes. What we want to do is we want to move towards a more equal society, in particular in credit, housing, and employment, insurance as well. And so maybe the best way to do that is just to look at the outcomes without regards to true outcomes. So disparate impact in a visual sense this is an example. And let's say that we're looking at a model and it's using your average account balance to predict your next month's account balance. And we might see a model that's trying to do that in order to give an offer for some kind of credit product. The goal is to increase spending, and so the bank might create this model and then go out and actually give offers. Now, what we see here is that the triangles, the blue triangles, are men. And we see that men are much more on the right side and the higher amount, which means that both their predictions and their actual spending is going to be higher. On the left-hand side, we see far more females. That, again, kind of in the converse, means that women are less likely to have higher spending. If this model is ultimately going to be used where a higher prediction is favorable, what you're going to end up doing is disfavoring women. Now, here, again, that model is going to presumably be accurate. And that doesn't matter because women, despite the accuracy, are getting less favorable outcomes more frequently. And so that's evidence of disparate impact, and it goes on to questions of what can you do about it. I want to contrast that with differential validity. So this is a similar type of thing. And what we see is that credit card spend is underestimated for all women and overestimated for all men between when the average of account balance is between $2,000 and $4,000. And you can see that in that the women are always above the predicted line and men are always below it. So that's a representation of a model that is biased at this point. And it's going to, for this group of people, harm women. And that would be an example of potentially a disparate treatment case, definitely a bias case. And there's really no room for bias in most legal frameworks is the general view. And so if you have a model that is doing something like this, it's really something you need to look at and assess and do something about. One of the points that I think is really important, excuse me while I take a sip of water. The academic work and a lot of the discussions among data scientists about fairness and bias in AI have been really wonderful and really productive, I think. But what they've missed is that there's already an existing framework for fairness, discrimination mitigation, and fairness assessment. And having worked in this for 20 plus years, I actually think that the disparate treatment, disparate impact framework is really solid and can get to virtually all of the questions and all of the areas that we would want to address as model builders to try and make our models fair. And so there's two things that we want to do. One of them is we want to remove disparate treatment and model bias. If you are predicting credit outcomes and you're including a variable for are you African American or are you a woman, that is illegal discrimination and you need to get rid of it. In the machine learning context, when you get into alternative data, if you're using information from about marketing, what websites you go to, things like that, it's entirely possible that you are essentially creating a variable that is a dummy variable for race or gender or age or another protected group. So those variables, those functions that create those variables have to be removed in order for you not to be illegally discriminating against a customer. Once you've gotten to that far, the next question is this idea of a burden shifting test. And this is where we get to disparate impact. And disparate impact, again, is this idea that there are unconditioned differences in outcomes. Men's, actually, that's not a good example. And then the example of credit, where almost always you see that African Americans and Hispanics receive loans at a lower rate than whites, that's disparate impact. It's not necessarily illegal. So this first step, just ask the question, does that exist? Do we see a disparate impact? If we do, then we go on to the second question. Does the model have a valid business justification? And in the words of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, is it empirically derived and demonstrably and statistically sound? And for most credit models made by the larger lending institutions, that's almost a foregone conclusion. The data are not typically that far out there. They're pretty obviously closely related, if not causally related, to credit outcomes. And there's also just a standard of practice that is well enforced. And so that second step, depending on the industry you're in and what you've done, may or may not be a big hurdle. In employment, oftentimes it can be a much bigger hurdle. If you have psychologists who are developing employment tests, and the degree to which that is empirically derived and demonstrably and statistically sound, and there's a fair amount of variance in that, in my experience. And so there you may need to focus more on that second prong. And then the final step is, if you answer yes to the question of is it justified, you next have to go to the question of, are there alternative models that are fairer, but still meet that valid business reason? So the way we think of that is, are there models that reduce those differences in outcomes, basically lift up the number of African Americans or Hispanics who are getting loans while still maintaining the predictive quality of the model? And the question, or the answer to this, is to the question of, can you do this? We've been doing it. My firm has been doing this since the mid-90s. I was in high school then, so I was not involved in it at that point. And what we found is that, in fact, you can do this, and you can find high quality alternatives that do meet business needs. And what we're trying to do in finding those is finding models that are on the Pareto frontier. And the Pareto frontier is a concept, says that let's find the model for which we have the least disparity and the highest quality. Or conversely, we have the highest quality for a given level of disparity. And all of these models on this outside circle are those Pareto frontier models. And within the context of regulation and the disparate impact framework, we are allowed to consider this business validity question. And what we have here, just to back up and explain a bit, you can think about this y-axis as being the level of quality of the model. So this might be the AUC or the KS or whatever metrics you might use. So a higher value is better. And then increased fairness is on the horizontal axis and going to the right. So the further we get to the right, the closer we are to parity in outcomes. And this black line represents that minimum viable model in terms of model quality. So you run all these different models, or you use whatever technique you have, and you try and find the models on this frontier. And what you want to do is look at these models. And eventually, if you're able to find them, usually you can, you choose the one that meets the business needs well is the fairest. And as an example of this actually at work, this is a model that we did for an insurance company for a healthcare algorithm. I believe it was. Actually, I'm not 100% sure that it was a healthcare algorithm, but it was an algorithm. And what we did was we developed a number of different models that followed the same structure as the initial algorithm, which was an XGBoost. And we tried to see whether or not different configurations would result in a high quality and fair model. And each model represents, or each dot represents a model. And as we go from blue up to red, those are the models that were built over time. So essentially we started with our algorithm developing these blue models. And as we ran, the quality continued to improve and improve until we got to these red ones. And these red ones represent the Pareto frontier. And what we see here is again, this is quality on this axis and disparity on this axis. So one represents a model that was equally as unfair as the baseline model that was originally used. And a one over here means that it was equally high quality as the baseline model. And so depending on the company and its business needs and its other processes and procedures in model governance, what you would want to do is start looking at these red models that are on the frontier and pick one that is high in quality and low in disparity. One of the most interesting things about this, and I've seen this come up in a number of the models that we've done, is we have two clusters. And what's especially interesting about this is these are not driven by single features very often. Like what you might expect to see is that maybe these models use feature X1 and these models use feature X2, but it's not that. It's actually much more complex. It's interactions between features and hyperparameters that ultimately can create these separations. And so what that tells me is that this process is not easy. Really finding these Pareto frontier models and making sure you don't end up in this area where, yes, they're a lot more fair, but no, they're not going to be viable, is going to take a lot of work and take a lot of investigation. So now I can jump into a quick code demonstration, but I wonder if before I do that, if I should pause for any questions. We've gone through quite a bit.
I think, Nick, thanks so much for this detailed presentation. I think there's one question. Does AI model discrimination due to flawed model structure causing the AI model to generate false positives or input error?
Sorry, let me read it.
Yeah, let me read the question again. So, does AI model discrimination due to flawed model structure causes the AI model to generate false positives or input error? So, Jamie, I think if you could clarify the question a little bit further, it'll be better. But Nick, if you understood the question, feel free to go ahead.
I think I do, and so a question, or I'll answer the question. And I was once advised, if someone asks you a question in a presentation, you don't want an answer to the question you wish they had asked. So I will do that here. And so the question I will answer is, can a flawed model create discrimination? And the answer is absolutely yes. And I had a number of slides that I'm going to use in a subsequent presentation where what I want to outline is, if you think about a model, it's y equals f of x plus epsilon. So the outcome is f of x, so the x being the data, f being the model, and the error. Well, to the extent that x is different for blacks and whites, whatever groups, then that's going to lead into differences in the outcomes. But to whatever extent f, the function, is different than for different groups, then that can lead to differences in outcomes. And a model that is not sufficiently trained on the right data or is incorrectly parameterized, then that absolutely can lead to discrimination. And I think the facial recognition algorithm is a great example of that. Because the data were insufficient, the algorithm was flawed. And that's one way that can happen. The other way is just bad model building. I think you're not specifying a correct functional form. You can have all the data in the world, but if x impacts as a curve and you're modeling it as a straight line, if blacks and whites are distributed differently along x, then that functional form that you're pushing, the linear functional form, is going to create some sort of differential outcome. And that means that you can discriminate as a result of a flawed model.
And can I ask a couple of questions, Nick? I know one is in the context of the life cycle of a model, where do you see the discussion of fairness incorporated as one of the steps? Is it something which every developer who is involved with the data science process and the machine learning process needs to kind of, just basically make it a part of their tool chain as they're building models? Or is it more of a gating process wherein before you deploy, you're going through a governance checklist or making sure that you are adhering to certain guidelines or policies, legislations, etc.? Or is it more of every stage has to have some kind of assessment, but also you're talking about metrics and testing in the next section? But is that a part of your assessment process, or is it integrated as a part of the development process itself?
It really depends. There are some very important legal considerations that need to be addressed, especially if you are in credit, housing, employment, or insurance. Mm-hmm. If you get that wrong when you're incorporating the fairness assessment, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. And so if you're involved in those industries, you want to absolutely make sure that you're working with lawyers and compliance who understand those questions. Because even if you do things with the best of intentions, if you do them at the wrong point, you can be guilty of disparate treatment discrimination and have a lawsuit brought against you. And even if you improve outcomes for let's say, African Americans or Hispanics, what we almost always see is that there's some negative effect for Asians. In credit, it's African Americans and Hispanics overall are negatively affected relative to whites, and Asians are positively affected. And so if you do something to try and fix the negative outcomes for Blacks and Hispanics, oftentimes that results in worsening of outcomes for Asians. Well, and an example of that is not directly algorithmic is in affirmative action programs in college admissions. And as a result of those programs, a group of Asian students has sued various colleges, I think Harvard, one of them, for discriminating because of the affirmative action programs. And so if you don't get it right, you can face some serious penalties. But if you're not in one of those industries, then do everything you can. I think that there is an element of every stage, though. You should be reviewing the data and making sure that there's nothing, there's just offensive things that all of us should know are offensive, and they should not get into a model. And they should not even be part of the potential variables in the model. And too often I do see those. And so in the data review doesn't necessarily have to be a particularly quantitative exercise. In fact, in my experience, it's usually compliance and lawyers who focus on that. And it's more the smell test. Then in the red flag variables get taken out. The yellow, maybe those go on to some sort of quantitative testing. Once you do that, within those contexts of the regulated industries, you should probably not be testing when you develop a model. And instead, it's in the stage where you're almost done building the model. That's when typically the question of discrimination and mitigation gets addressed.
Oh, thank you. So I think we'll continue with the presentation and hold on. If we have some questions, we'll see how many we can answer at the end.
Yeah, great. And so, as usual, I talked longer than I intended to, so I will have to go through this example a little bit quickly. But what I wanted to do is just show some code and show some output that shows how we might test a model and what we might be able to do to minimize discrimination. And of course, we at Solas and at BLDS, we have some really fancy ways to deal with these things. What I want to show here is that you can use some pretty dumb stuff and make some good progress. So, and not dumb, but just it's not sophisticated, and yet you're able to have a good impact. And so I think that the point here is, well, I would love for all of you to buy Solas as a product. If you don't, you can still move the ball forward. So we've just got a data set. This is a synthetic data set that I'll show you what it looks like. And we have variables x1 through x45. And then we have information on the race and the gender of people in the synthetic data set. And ultimately, our label is bad. So did you default on a loan? And we're going to build a simple XGBoost model, 50 estimators, so it runs reasonably quickly. And we run the predictions, calculate the AUCs. And what we find is the training AUC is 86.6, which is pretty darn good for a relatively small model. Degree of underfit's probably not too bad. Now, here we get into that disparity testing. So the question of what metrics to use. If it is a binary outcome, yes, no, and it is rankable. So we can say, virtually every consumer would prefer this over this. In the case of a credit decision, virtually every consumer would prefer to get a loan they applied for, and then get rejected. And so here we use this adverse impact ratio, and it's got a long history of acceptance. And what it says is, let's look at the percent of the protected class that receives a favorable outcome over the percent of the reference group. So 5% of African Americans receive a loan or are offered a loan, and 10% of whites are offered a loan. That 5% over 10%, or 1/2, is the adverse impact ratio. Once we have that number, we can assess what's called practical significance. And practical significance is a little bit fuzzy, but in terms of the standards you might use, or whether or not it might actually represent something that can kind of get you out of jail figuratively, is a little bit fuzzy, and that's where you really want to rely on lawyers and others who have a lot of experience in this. But generally, there's a threshold that you would want to use, which would be, in the case of the 4/5 test, which comes from employment law, it says, is that AIR below 0.8 or 4/5? And we also add a question of, is it statistically significantly different than parity? Not different than the threshold, but different than parity. And you use a 5% two-tailed test. We're really doing a 2.5% one-tailed. If you describe it that way, it confuses lawyers. So the question of data scientists versus lawyers, if you want to have a long conversation about a 5% two-tailed test versus a 2.5% one-tailed test with someone who hates math, I prefer just to use the 5% two-tailed. I'll put it that way. And if it's below the threshold and it's significant, then that goes on to that next prong of the disparate impact framework of the burden shifting test, which is to say, is the model valid? And in the data set we're looking at, we're going to say that 20% of the people in the data are going to get offers. We're going to set this threshold at 0.8, and we're going to say a lower score is favorable. The less likely you are to default, the better. Now, here we measure the disparate impact using the adverse impact ratio, and we output the results. Let's see, I have 2 minutes. Sri, can I go longer, or like 5 minutes?
Please continue. Yeah, so
okay.
Please.
All right.
Yeah.
So here we have the results, the adverse impact ratio, and the column over here, which shows the big red number, that's what we want to care about the most. And what we see is that it's 0.4, which is way below 0.8. So in this case, 8.6% of Blacks are receiving an offer for a loan, whereas 21.2% of whites are. So a 0.408, and it is statistically significant, is really quite bad and would be cause for concern and further assessment. What we see from the other groups is Hispanics, there's not really an issue, and it's actually favorable for Asians and favorable for women. So we won't worry too much about them. We also do this for the validation. Overall, we see similar results. The adverse impact ratio is quite a bit higher here, and I was just pointing that out as something we would want to review and consider, figure out why that's going on. Now, we've got 45 variables. We've got a machine learning model that's pretty complicated. What do we do about it? Because what we really need to do in order to find that alternative model that is highly predictive but has lower disparities, we need to understand what's going on. Because if you have 45 features and you think, I'm going to drop some number of them, add some number of them, it becomes computationally infeasible to do that in any kind of time frame that is humanly possible. So what we want to do is we want to kind of bootstrap this approach. And we'll bootstrap it using explainable AI, and we'll say, let's use Shapley values. For those of you who haven't experienced them or haven't worked with them, Shapley values are some really nice, approach to feature attribution at the individual level. What I mean by that is that it is going to assign a certain amount of credit for each feature for each person. And to show what this looks like, here we got some examples. And so we have a person's prediction, and these are the Shapley values for all the different features, and it'll go all the way to the right to X45. And what it says here for this variable X09 is that drove the value that this person had for X09 drove their prediction up by 0.0022, whereas X10 drove it down 0.0273. So X10, because the lower value is favorable, X10 really did some good stuff for this person's prediction. X9 had a marginally negative effect. Now that we got feature contribution at the individual level, we can start looking up at that group fairness level. And what we want to do is, I'll skip over just a couple of things. I'll run them to make sure everything runs, but okay, yeah, this is the one that I want to look at. So this is a very pretty chart, but what we can do with these individual SHAP values is we can aggregate them to those groups that we care about, whites versus blacks, and then we can look at the difference. And what we see here is that this feature X35, it drove blacks up on average 0.066. But it drove whites down by negative 0.02. That's a difference of 0.086, which is a large difference, has a large influence on the predictions and on the disparity. Now, importantly, SHAP values are approximate within the framework that I'm describing, and there are also many, many ways to parameterize them, which, if you don't do it right, will not get you nearly as precise results. But this is a pretty good indicator that these are the top variables that are going to drive disparities. And so what I'm going to look at is I want to see what's going on with X35. I'm also going to look at X43. X43 is way down on the list. It doesn't really have much of an impact. In fact, it's a little bit favorable for blacks. So we have here the distribution of the Shapley values on the x-axis and how frequently they occur on the y. So this is like a histogram, but just with smooth lines. And so what we see is that blacks are much more likely to be up on this right-hand side, whereas whites are much more likely to be over on the left. And that's where that disparity is being driven. On the other hand, this X43, which is mildly favorable to blacks, we see that there's a little bit more favorability going on here for blacks than for whites. Another thing to note, and this is really important as well, is when you're thinking about I want a highly predictive model, is the SHAB values in this context tell you how important the variable is. These are in log odds, and larger log odds value is basically telling you the degree of surprise in the outcome. And so you want to have variables that are generally larger in log odds. And if you look at the scale here, negative 0.04 to positive 0.04 versus negative 0.4 to positive 0.6, this variable is just not really doing anything. And so even though it's favorable, not important. So what we're going to try and do, and this is the quick example of making a difference, is we're going to try and drop different features. So this is just going up to this list of the biggest drivers of disparity according to our SHAP approximation, and let's drop them in every way that we can. And I'm going to run this. Now it's running all the different models. And this just takes a second. And so here we have each different model, and we have the change in the training AUC, the change in validation AUC, and the change in the adverse impact ratio, and change in percent offers. What we're going to focus on is disparity, is the right two columns. And what we can see is that the Shapley values didn't do a perfect job. There are times where we drop these variables that looked like they would have a favorable outcome, and they actually resulted in worse outcomes. So if you're just using Shapley values, you're not going to get as far as you need to. But we do see that they work in certain cases. And here we've got about a 1% improvement in AIR. Here we've got a nearly 2% improvement, and that happens when we drop all three of those variables. And we can, in fact, increase the offer rate by 3% for African Americans, which represents a really sizable increase. You know, if this is a mortgage lending, sizable increase in the number of people number of African Americans who are able to buy homes. There are drops in quality. This 1.7% may or may not be too severe. If we look at the other ones, we've got 29 basis point drop in validation AUC for an 88 basis point increase in AIR. One of these might be valid, and I'm gonna say that this one is. And so we just run that, and that's going to be our proposed baseline. And here's the final AIR results. And so we've got a nice increase in the AIR, and hopefully the business will find that this is a reasonable model, and you can put it into production and show your regulators, show the public if you want to, that you've done something about making your AI model fairer. So with that, I will stop. Thank you again, Sri.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. This was excellent. A couple of, I think there are still a couple of questions, but I think we are running up like 10 minutes late, so we should probably start wrapping up. Question, is this notebook, can you share this, or is this something we can discuss later?
I can share the notebook. It does, the AIR calculation uses proprietary code, though you can backwards engineer it from looking at it. I didn't say that, but you can. That part. So if I can I'll send it as a PDF if that works.
That works great. And also, any concerns about like the slides? Can we share the slides too?
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. So I think there are a couple more questions, but I think I'll just leave it at like one generic question in here. How do you assess the state of fairness in terms of maturity And how do we kind of think about the next 5 years in terms of integration of fairness related both discussions and assessments as a part of the machine learning building framework itself? Do you have any kind of thoughts from your crystal ball?
I think we're at a crossroads, and I'm worried that we may make some really bad decisions. There are a lot of people who are involved in the conversation who I don't think see the full picture of the business necessity. And there are a lot of people involved in the conversation who don't recognize how terrible these things can be if they're not careful. And my hope is that we can convince people that the framework that I've outlined here is a reasonable framework and will capture and do a pretty good job of mitigating many of the problems.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much. And I know there are a lot of regulatory discussions happening. There are a lot of discussions and white papers. I keep seeing references to, fairness, but many a times, the aspects of how do we pragmatically approach this and how do we make sure that we can operationalize many of these concepts and not just leave them as, discussion topics in white papers is the most important thing. And thank you for bringing that pragmatism as a part of this presentation. I know you do this on at least like 60 hours a week. So we kind of, shared the lessons from the trenches, if you will. And I think that's one of the goals we have as a part of this whole series of guest lectures. It's not only trying to appreciate the complexities and the nuances in the various themes and the topics with respect to AI and machine learning, but also bringing that pragmatic lens on what does it take to operationalize these concepts in the industry, and how do practitioners take these concepts and then make it real, because ultimately the truth is the pudding, right? It's about how do we make sure that these concepts can be integrated as a part of your tool chain, as a part of your operational process, and also educate people on how do we make this a possibility as a part of your assessment. So in that light, thank you for sharing your knowledge. I know it's not easy to just pick up a book and just kind of understand this whole complex theme, but thank you for making it easily accessible to the audience. And if you have any questions for Nick, that's Nick's contact information. Please reach out to him. And I can guarantee you that he's so passionate about it, he's going to get back to you even if it's midnight for him. With that said, I will invite you again for our next topic, which is going to be about causality, and that's going to be a very interesting topic in the next week. So please stay tuned for invitations. And if you have any questions for us at Quant University, please reach out to us through our website, www.quantuniversity.com. Next week, we are starting out the live sessions for the AI risk management program. So if you're interested in knowing about the program or have any questions regarding that, please reach out to us through our website. With that said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week, and we will see you soon. Thank you again.
Thank you.